So, hi there, and welcome to Poetry Passages. I'm Clifford Rames, and it's been a really long while, but it feels so good to be back, especially since we're back with a brand new episode in the David Budbill Poetry Series, which is a celebration of the life and poetry of poet David Budbill, presented to you in partnership with the literary estate of David Budbill. Now, just a reminder, David Budbill was a beloved poet and playwright from Vermont. And over the course of his lifetime, David authored 8 books of poetry and 7 plays. We lost David in 2016, but his legacy lives on, and David continues to win over and influence generations of poetry lovers and writers. And then joining me today to share some of his recollections about David Budbill is actor and director Nathaniel Warren White. Hi, Nathaniel, or I think you prefer to be called Nate, or does it matter? Nat?
Nat is fine. Yeah. Hi,
Nat is
Cliff.
fine. Yeah. Nat,
Yeah.
great. Well, thanks so much for coming on the program, Nat. It's been a long slog getting you here, but I'm glad we finally got you here.
Me too. Yeah. I was excited when I heard that you were doing this and had talked with Nadine and Lois about it. And so I'm very pleased to be here.
Well, thank you so much. And I believe at one point when I was trying to get in touch with you, you were out at sea, right? You were sailing around the world or something.
That may be. I did sail around the world, but I think probably when we were first in contact, I was sailing with my son up in British Columbia.
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
guessing that's where I was because that would have been last summer sometime, I think. Yeah.
yeah, over the summer, yeah.
So I sailed up through the inside passage with my son Josh last summer.
Oh wow, how fast! So you have a sailboat.
Well, I do. He has a sailboat that I was sailing on at that point, but I
Okay.
also have a little sailboat here in Maine where I live. The big boat that we took around the world was sold a while back.
Oh,
So
okay. All right. Cool. Well, I know that I referred to you as an actor and a writer and a director, but I have a feeling that I'm like vastly understating your resume. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about yourself and
sure, I started my career as an actor. Spent many years in New York and Boston, and eventually landed in Maine, where I grew up. Um, I taught acting in Boston for a number of years at Emerson College and Boston University and the conservatories, New England, Boston conservatories there as well. And I was a part of the Sheer Madness company in Boston, which is the long running comedy, the hit comedy that just went under because of COVID,
oh
unfortunately.
no.
Yeah, yeah. So I was in that show for 10 years, which was quite a journey. But I did a lot of theater, and theater's always been my first love. And since I've come back to Maine, I've been doing some directing and acting here as well. But
Mm.
mostly what I've done in recent years is coaching. I work as an executive coach, helping people in business and in the nonprofit world become better actors,
Right.
how to speak and talk and walk and all that good stuff. So that's been my income, shall we say? That's where. But the theater has always been my first love.
My guess would be that your executive coaching business is not called Sheer Madness.
It might be, but it's not. It's called Flashpoint.
Flashpoint. Very
Yeah.
cool. So how let's talk about David Budbill. I know that you have a long history with him, but how far back do you guys actually go?
I met David, excuse me, when we were first working together at McCarter Theater in Princeton.
Okay. Hmm.
His play Judevine, which I am very attached to. I've been part of 3 productions, I think, but I think it was the premiere. The first performances of Judevine were done at McCarter in 1980, early 80s. I say 84. Sounds like Lois may say 82. I don't know, but we're somewhere in the early 80s. And I was an actor working in New York at that point, and I got a call from, excuse me, a call from the casting people at McCarter. I think they'd heard about me through a mutual friend who suggested that I might be a good choice for the play, and so I went down there and auditioned for Judevine, and they hired me, and that's where it all began. It was a wonderful, wonderful journey.
Well, when we mention Judevine, I should point out for folks who may not be familiar that Judevine is a collection of poems about characters in a fictional place based upon where David lived in Vermont, loosely based, or I don't know how closely based. That's up to some dispute. But it's a wide-ranging collection of poems and stories that form a narrative and a fictional northern Vermont town. It was later adapted into a play, about which we're discussing right now, right? And I think in a little bit you're going to read out of Judevine, but we'll get to that.
Yeah.
So in the productions of Judevine that you did back in the early 80s, what did you performed as an actor or you directed? What was your role?
Well, I started as an actor. That we were an ensemble of 4 actors at McCarter Theater who played all the roles. There are about 20, 25 roles in the play. And we shared those. I actually played David in that because David's the narrator in the play.
Right.
I played David, which was an honor. I didn't know David very well at that point, but I got to know him quite well because he was there for the whole rehearsal process. And when a playwright is in the audience for a rehearsal process, it can be quite intimidating, as you can imagine.
I bet.
David was very demanding. I mean, he was more than anybody I think I've ever worked with. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he knew how the characters should be portrayed. And in his own mind, he saw them very clearly. So that's a challenge for an actor to meet a playwright in that place. And but I came to love both him and the play and all the characters. There's so many wonderful characters in it, and I feel like I feel like in the end we did the play justice, and I think he felt really good about it. But it was an interesting, as all early rehearsal processes are. It was an interesting journey.
Yeah, I can imagine, being an actor with the playwright in the audience watching your rehearsals that, to try to live up to his vision and what's going on in his head and just to know that he's watching your every move. I mean, you did it though, right?
We did it, and the audiences loved it. And I loved it so much that I later produced and directed a production of it in Boston at the Boston Playwrights Theater. And then when I moved to Maine, I did a production of it at the Theater Project here in Brunswick, Maine. That was about, I don't know, 15 years ago. It was probably just before David passed away. But I still go back to it, and I'm actually thinking about maybe staging another production of it here in Maine in another couple of years, because I just love it, and I don't think it's very timely still, and it still speaks to audiences, I believe.
Yeah, it's timely, and it's chock full of timeless characters who, are, I mean, even though the book was written, 40 years ago or so, many of these characters, I'm sure, still live up there in Maine, or people like them.
People in Maine,
in Vermont and Maine and New England, yeah.
Yeah. When I first was learning the roles in Judevine, we were in rehearsal. I had some friends who lived up in the Northeast Kingdom of Vermont, near where David lived. And I called them and I said, I got to get this Vermont accent thing down because it's different than Maine. And I'm not, I need to. So can I come visit, and we can visit some real Vermont people so I can hear what they sound like? And it was wonderful. I went up there and met some people who aren't in the play, but wonderful characters who live up there, including a dairy farmer who I spent a day with. And I had a wonderful time, and I learned about what it's like to live up there in a way that I never understood.
Yeah, often, I know if I do it as well, when I think of David Budbill, I think of someone who was keenly aware and in love with nature, aware of and in love with nature, who wrote a lot about his life in Vermont, in rural Vermont, and the mountains of northern Vermont, and what it meant to live there. But at the same time, he wasn't a recluse. You know, David was a keen people watcher, it seems to me. I mean, I didn't know him, but just from reading what he wrote, he seemed to really have a keen eye for human character. And a lot of those characters, which kind of are characteristics, are universal even today and live on in the characters of Judevine, which I think is so interesting. So a revival, I think, would be much welcomed and needed.
I agree, and I think, I mean, it's a wonderful play about community and how community can pull together despite all their differences and all the difficulties that they face.
Right.
But in the end, they become one, and that's the play really speaks to that, I think.
Yeah. And the timeliness of that, I mean, just think about the COVID world and where we all were as a country community, all locked down and taking care of our neighbors, watching out for our neighbors and our families, and getting to know our locales again, right? We were also busy commuting and running off and to our jobs, and suddenly we're getting to know where we live once again. But David always knew where he lived, and he celebrated that in all of his writings. Do you
He
agree?
did, and you say he wasn't a recluse, but I think there was a part of David that really was a recluse, and that he enjoyed that the spirit of reclusiveness that he found. And you're right, he was also a real people person. He loved people and he loved writing about people, but there was a part of him that really, I think, really thrived being up there alone in northeastern in the Northeast Kingdom in Vermont. And he left from a city life. He was in New York and lived in Ohio he grew up in Ohio, I think, and he wasn't a country boy, but he certainly became one.
Well, on that note, and that he was, while he was a people person, he also wanted to be left alone. You wanted to read a poem called Weather Report, and I think that poem kind of gets a little bit at what you were driving at, right?
I agree, and I love this poem because I don't know, David. He I think people, when they read his poetry, sometimes they think he dwells on the darkness or the difficult parts of life, but David has a wonderful sense of humor, and it comes through in this poem in a terrific way, I think. I Laughing with David was always a treat. I mean, and we had some good laughs there, and he was a very serious guy. You know, he took poetry and life very seriously, and he didn't hold back about that. So anyway, let me share this poem because it touches me. I found it again the other day. I love it. It's called Weather Report. The weather is horrible here on Judevine Mountain. It's dark and cold all winter. Every day, rain and snow beat on your head, and the sun never shines. Then it's spring, and more rain and ice and mud too. And after that, the black flies eat you alive, and then the deer flies, and then the mosquitoes, and then it's fall before you've ever noticed it was summer. Then there might be a couple of weeks of decent weather, and then it starts to rain and snow again. It's just awful living here. I don't think you'd like it here at all. You better go find your own miserable place to live.
Love that, yeah. He had a smirk on his face as he was writing that, right?
I did, he
Well,
did. And he did. I mean, I think if you just dropped by to visit David, it would be kind of like that. He'd say, well, this is where I live. Isn't it pretty awful? But let me show you why it's wonderful too. And then he'd introduce you to the birds and and the vegetables and.
Right. Yeah, I mean, in a way, it's kind of like, look where I live. It's so beautiful here, but boy, would you hate it. You would hate it. Just find your own place, right? Go, don't settle here. Find your own mountain.
And he didn't want anybody too close either. So,
Right. Well, that poem was called Weather Report, and it comes out of David's book, While You Still Got Feet, right there, which was published by Copper Canyon Press. Really great book. So yeah, tell us about So as you were doing these productions of Judevine over the years, were you in touch with David the whole time, or was he coming to shows here and there? Or...
Yeah, we were in touch a lot, and it's interesting because the play evolved a lot over the years. It's a different play now than it was when I did it there first, when we first did it at McCarter. Um, there are characters that were in that play that aren't in the current version. I was just reading the current version yesterday because Nadine sent it to me. I wanted to look at it again, and it's quite different. There are things I miss about the original version, and there are things that I appreciate that have evolved. So as I imagine this was true for me, but as each production evolved, whoever was directing it and working on it was in touch with David. And if there were things that we wanted to change or things that we felt like could be done differently, you'd have to check in, of course, with David about that because he had last say on all of it. And then there were times when we had to convince him that, yeah, maybe it would be better if we did it this way, or what if we tried this instead? And he was always willing to try things, but he also was very sure about what worked and what didn't.
Right, right. So David was always consulted on these edits and rewrites and changes
Yeah,
and signed off on them.
yeah, I wouldn't have changed anything without his permission. And
Yeah.
I, but plus, I just loved working the fact that it was a living document and could be changed and could be worked on meant a lot to me. And I think it did to him too. He was just happy that people wanted to do that.
So what like were the changes more in terms of how characters were developed and how they sort of themselves evolved through the ages, or what were some of the changes that you could think of?
Yeah, it was some of it was character development, but the characters, the ones that are in the play now, are pretty much drawn the way they were in the original version. Just he removed some of them and replaced them with some other ones. The book of the Judevine, the total volume that you mentioned before, has all the poems in it, and only a few of them are really in the play. So it's really interesting to go back and read all of them and get a fuller sense of
Hmm.
of the total Judevine community because it's very deep and very rich. The other thing that changed that I noticed when I was reading the play the other day was the way he ended the play. The way the play ends now. When he wrote it first, it had a very apocalyptic ending. There was reference to a nuclear apocalypse and how, he found himself standing in the stream where he fished up in Walcott, where they lived up in Judevine, and all of a sudden he had this vision of the end of the world that was basically a nuclear disaster, and that's gone now. That piece was I suspect was quite controversial at the time, although I don't remember people being upset by it. I just think we were in a time when that was very high on all of our radar, that idea, and it still is, but not so much now as it was back in the 80s, I think. And
Right.
David was a real political activist in many ways. I mean, he strived hard to make change in the world in his own way, and he stood up for what he believed in without any. There was no holding back for David. I love that about him. So when that piece about the horror of what could happen to the world was added to the play, I thought, hey, why not? I mean, this is important for people to think about. Not easy, but important.
Right, right. Well, in a way, I don't know how the new version ends, and nor should you give it away, but I can imagine there's a different kind of apocalypse happening now. It may not be nuclear, but it's one perhaps of our own making as well through, the collapse of the environment and the climate, which I'm not even sure if that's where David went with his new ending, but it would be, sort of the more timely version than what maybe we were experiencing in the early 80s with the fall of the Soviet Union and all of that. So,
Yeah, no, and David, I mean, David cared so much about nature and everything that
yeah.
he learned and lived in, and so I think that is still at the heart of the play Judevine, and I won't tell you how it ends, but it is definitely a part of what he held close and wanted all of us to appreciate and understand about our world, how delicate and how fragile and vulnerable it is.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned to me earlier that you, in one of the productions of Judevine, that you played a character. You played multiple characters, but one of them was a character called Granny.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that and tell us about Granny? And I know you maybe wanted to read a few excerpts of Granny's place in Judevine.
Yeah, Granny is a wonderful character, and the poem that she's involved in, it's about her, is quite long, so I won't share all of it. But she's one of these characters that David drew on, and she may be based on somebody he actually knew. I don't know, but she's well, he says it in the beginning that everybody said she was crazy, and it comes out in the poem that you think, if you were to meet her the first time, you'd probably think she was crazy. And he says probably she was. But when he reveals to us her full character and takes us through an encounter with her, you begin to appreciate, and this is what David did with so many of his characters, that though your first impressions might be that they're off the wall and they're frightening, or they're in some way threatening, or that when you really get to know them, that they, like everybody, they have a heart and a soul, and that there's something there to connect with once you get to know them. And I think David did that with all his characters. Yeah. He showed us the heart and soul of every character that he presented to us, after maybe showing us the scary, dark, difficult parts. He'd say, but look at who this person really is, And,
yeah, it's a sobering reminder that everybody has a story, and everybody is dealing with some pain privately, perhaps, that feeds into who they are, and just writing them off with a quick first impression would be an injustice, right?
Yeah, and I think I totally agree, and I think one of the things that David gives us is a chance to really get to know people who we might not otherwise have chosen to get to know, or we might have been scared off from.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Granny's definitely one of those characters that she would scare you off at a first encounter, but
oh yeah.
Did you want to, like, there any sections about Granny that you wanted to read, or
well, I give you
just you want to talk about her?
No, I just give you the beginning of it, and then maybe it's interesting because he goes into a section where he's actually has Granny to speak. And when you hear some of this, you'll understand why, as an actor, it was a real challenge. So I'll just give you the beginning of it, and then I'll take you into a little of her dialect, which is fascinating. Granny lived down the road from Albert. She was 80 when she died. Everybody said she was crazy. Probably she was. She was suspicious of everyone. She had visions. She saw conspiracies. She thought every stranger who came along was out to get her. She always liked me because I waved when I went by. Granny had a cleft palate and no teeth. She was also hard of hearing, so when she talked to you, she shouted. Her husband died about 10 years ago. The winter he died, the house burned down. Granny spent the last decade of her life alone, living in a spring house and a camper trailer. She milked 10 cows a day, every day, twice a day, to the day she died. She was obsessed with the memory of her husband, Lee. She talked about him constantly, and when she did, she moaned a nasal, toothless, hair-lipped moan. So that's a little description of Granny. Now let me take you into just a bit of what Granny sounds like. And I haven't done this in years, so I'm going to try my best to both translate and get an understanding of, let you get an understanding of what Granny sounds like, and what, if you can understand anything she's saying. So I remember the first time I ever met Granny. I was bucking firewood one fall. Some maples the power company had let down along the lane into Uncle Clyde's. Granny shuffled over from her trailer on the hill. She was furious. What you doing? How you not doing? And my trees, how old how old you can cut them down. What are you doing in my tree? It's it ain't like it's in my land. I'll be, I'm an old woman, 76 years old, and my husband's dead, and I was burnt out. I live alone in a spring house and the trailer, and I milk the cows, and I'm here. So that's just a little bit
Wow.
of Grammy.
Wow. I was like, I couldn't wait to see how you managed that dialogue, and you did great.
Well, it takes a strain on my voice, which is recovering from COVID too. So I
Oh,
apologize, but you get a sense of who she is. And as David goes on and he writes, he says, "I apologize. I told her I didn't mean to steal her trees. I said I thought they were Clyde's trees. Granny mellowed and ended telling me that I was welcome to the wood." So, they become friends.
mm,
And in the end, she tells him about her husband, that she moaned and groaned to everybody about the fact that her husband Lee was no longer here. And she just was in despair and never got over that. But it was for me, playing that character when I first met her, it was both difficult, but it was very moving to me. She just touched my heart in so many ways, because she was a dear person who was suffering and went through such a horrible time. But there she was. She was a
right.
survivor, and she kept going.
Well, and there's a bit of a no a revelation here, a testament to who David was. David didn't shy away from this angry, heartbroken old woman. He waved at her every day, and that little act of kindness was recognized by Granny, and then they developed this friendship, and she ends up giving him the wood. And it's not just about anger, it's not just about misunderstanding. It's about tenderness, and it's about coming together as human beings, and getting to know each other and understand each other. And it's just such a beautiful, tender little touch that only, that David could have easily just drove by and ignored the crazy old lady, but he didn't, right?
No, he didn't. And like so many characters in the play and in his poetry, in Judevine particularly, he loved these people. And it's interesting because in the play there's a moment when a character named Grace, a young woman named Grace, accuses him of taking advantage of the people who live. She tells him, "I know you've written about us. I heard what you've done, and it ain't right. You should not be doing this." And then they have a heart-to-heart conversation about what that means to him and to her. And of course, they become friends too. But he took a lot of risks living
Yeah,
up there and speaking the truth about what it's like to live in a rural, uh, downtrodden and struggling to survive community that
right.
he was part of.
Yeah, yeah. Proudly part of. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, thank you, Nat. That was wonderful. Do you just before we wrap up, do you have like any memories or little bonds, little details about David that you'd like to share with us? Something that just kind of stands out in your mind after all these years, and now that David's gone. I mean, what really stands out in your mind about David?
Well, I think there were moments when I went up to visit him in his cabin up in Walcott and visit him and Nadine and Lois. And I just remember sitting around that wood stove, and Dave would play a Japanese flute, or he loved music. He loved Buddhist tradition and music from that part of the world and poetry from that part of the world. And he would share some of that love with us. And then we'd drink a cup of tea and sometimes have a little nip of sherry and watch the fire burn in the stove. And I just loved those times with David because they were truly a chance to get in touch with both him and the way he lived and the life he loved to live. It was a very simple life that he chose to live up there, and I admired him for doing it and for being willing to take the risk and the loss. I mean, he was always a little bit caught between, I wish I were a famous poet and I don't want anybody to know who I am. You know, it was like he was caught in between those two worlds. And he
Right.
writes about that. He writes poems about that, you know. And that always touched me. I sent you a photograph earlier, I think, of the
Yeah,
two of them. I have my hand on his head and he
on
has
his
his
head, right?
I think we were just sort of patting each other on the head, going, "It's okay. We're going to be all right here. Let's keep
Yeah,
going."
yeah, it's a great picture. Yeah. Um, well, that's wonderful. I mean, I'm so sorry that I never actually met David while he was alive, and but even so, I miss him, and I'm sure you miss him even more.
Uh,
Um, but
you,
let's.
you're doing him a great service, Cliff,
Oh, thank you, thank
and
you.
and the world. I mean, people need to get to know David's poetry and his beautiful writing in every way, and I'm hoping that that will happen more and more.
Right. Well, keep us posted about the Judevine revival. We're going to be watching for it.
I will.
And I know it's not just me. I've heard from a few different people that, a Judevine revival would be a good thing.
I agree, and let's hope it happens.
Let's
And not
hope. Yeah.
just here. I think it should happen maybe in Vermont. I hope too, and
Yeah. 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 Well, thanks so much. Nat Warren White, everybody, actor, poet, and David Budbill enthusiast. Thanks so much for coming on the program. And thanks to everyone for watching. And watch for Judevine coming soon to a theater near you, we hope.
thank you, Clifford.
You're welcome. Until next time, thanks for watching, and we'll see you real soon right here on Poetry Passages. Bye.